This is really just a summary of a presentation I was asked to give about 2 or 3 weeks ago to a sort of teaching and learning group in the genetics part of the biology department at the university, who do a huge amount of really fantastic work around innovative approaches to teaching and learning. And I was really just asked to put forward some ideas of some of the research I've done around sort of things like blended learning and so on, and I used it as an opportunity really just to think about some of the ideas and trajectories that my own thinking and research has gone through over the last few years. And I suppose what I wanted to do with this was to continue with the notion I have of what I call blended spaces, looking at investigations into really just the complex nature of spaces for learning. I guess as a geographer, I've always had an innate interest and I guess an innate tendency to look at things spatially. And therefore I just wanted to look at my own trajectory, my own developing ideas around learning and the dynamics of learning and the spaces in which those might occur. I suppose it's important that probably for about the last decade or so, first as a school teacher and then since moving into HE, a lot of my work has been around action research. And one of the things I like about action research is the way that I think you can be playful with it, you can experiment with it. It's not about doing sort of, in some ways, sort of quite traditional sort of academic inverted commas research where you've got to have some kind of completely riveted to the floor notion of exactly what it is you're going to do. It's actually about exploration and playing with ideas and working with other people. And as time's gone by, I suppose one of the sort of areas that I've been really interested in with this is using as a basis the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari, who, as philosophers, use space in a major way within their philosophical writings. And one of the things they talk about is the process of territorialization and deterritorialization. As the image shows here, they talk about smooth and striated spaces, and they talk about the idea of striated spaces, territorialization being about people following grooves, following almost predetermined patterns, habituated approaches to things and approaching the things the same way all the time, but that if we actually jump out of that, if we are perhaps creative, if we do something different, then that's a form of deterritorialization, that we're entering into smooth spaces where we can go in whatever direction we want, whilst accepting that in being creative, ultimately the vast majority of the time we'll only create new striated spaces for ourselves. We create new practice, but then that becomes habitual. So we're always sort of on these trajectories from habituated practice through creativity and back to that then becoming habituated again. And therefore, when we go off on these sort of tangents, when we go into this creative space, this smooth space, we might be sort of described as following what they call lines of flight, and therefore in many ways this presentation became a sort of a bit of an exploration of my own lines of flight in terms of exploring learning and learning spaces. I'm very much of the opinion that learning is what they would call a rhizomatic process. It's this idea that learning doesn't follow linear sort of directions. People don't just sort of go from A to B to C to D. That actually learning is rhizomatic. Even if we're interested in something, we're bringing in prior learning, we're bringing in stuff from tangents all over the place and creating networks of understanding. And therefore, I would argue that learning is a very complex process. It's complex in time, in terms of things like threshold concepts, that these big concepts within subjects where we don't sort of one day not understand something and the next day we do. We spend time grappling with ideas and trying to understand them and getting frustrated. But ultimately, when those big ideas, those big concepts click, our whole view of the subject changes. But it changes in a way that we can't go back on. So once we understand it, our conceptualizations of that subject fundamentally change. I think learning is a complex process in space. It's experiential. No learning is wholly abstract. Even what seems abstract is actually using our previous experiences, perhaps as analogies or just as part of that learning process. And also, learning is complex because it's ubiquitous. We can't help learning as human beings. We soak up learning because it is experiential to some degree. And within that, I use an approach to learning very much taken from Knud Lerris, a Danish psychologist who believes there are sort of three elements to learning: the cognitive, what's going on inside our heads; the emotional, the idea that we can't learn effectively unless we have motivation, or what he calls sort of the sort of mental energy to make it happen; and also social. That actually learning very much is about interaction, not necessarily sort of traditional staged group work, although it can be that. But we can argue that, for example, if we're reading a book, we're learning socially, we're interacting with somebody else, perhaps asynchronously, but we're interacting with somebody else, we're interacting with the ideas that they've included in that book. So learning is this wonderful process, wonderfully complex process, not something that can be, to my mind, sort of sliced into 3 parts in a 50-minute lesson in anything like a meaningful way. Those are episodes of learning, but how they relate to the wider process of somebody learning over a period of time is not as simple as all of that. So really just sort of some insights into ways that my notions about learning and learning spaces have developed. And I suppose where I started with this was through PhD research that I completed while I was still working in school. It focused on secondary geography. I was very lucky to be involved in a pilot GCSE project that started about 8-9 years ago. In the first year, there were only 18 schools nationally did it, and it grew over 2 or 3 years to eventually include 80 schools before it was finally dropped by the last government, and sort of we had to go back to sort of really quite sort of traditional notions of geography in some ways, certainly to my mind. But there was this brief period where we got a real opportunity to do some really exciting stuff, and because there were so few schools, there weren't textbooks. You had to be, it was throwing you into a position where you had to be creative, almost throwing you into a sort of deterritorialized state. And one of the ways that I took this through my PhD research was to do action research over the course of a year, and during that year I actually used student participation in curriculum development. I co-constructed approaches to pedagogy and curriculum with the students, and sort of the diagram here just gives an idea eventually as to where we got to. The kind of conceptualization of learning and pedagogy that I had there was that we were within the classroom. You had an intersection of learning, assessment and curriculum, but that actually what made those three things come together successfully was this dialogue between myself and the students. And we just started to create a classroom space and a way of learning that I couldn't have predicted at the start of the year when we did it. It took me by surprise. I think it took some of the kids by surprise. That the results were absolutely fantastic. Although, for me, to a degree, they were of secondary importance. I expected that to happen because we were getting the learning right. And therefore we sort of, created this system where we had to learn a differentiated curriculum, where we started creating personal and critical autonomy, where students had curriculum choice within a single group, where learning had that sort of cognitive, emotional and social dimension to it. And where learning and assessment, the boundary between learning and assessment in many ways started to dissolve, with a sort of continued expanded discourse where we were talking about the content, we were talking about the learning as well, but it was a two-way process. And what was really interesting with some of the students by the end of the year, not all, but certainly with some of the students by the end of the year, both they and I were in the kind of learning we wanted to do in terms of the way that we wanted to take the curriculum and the assessment. We were beginning to find classrooms as a box inside four walls as being really quite restrictive spaces. We wanted to do more and different things. Before I could take that much further, I then moved into the HE. And the next sort of area that I went into was really beginning to think about how to develop notions of blended learning within teacher training. So I was working alongside really starting geography teachers, and again was trying to sort of talk with them and develop ways of approaching learning where, yes, we were using face-to-face sessions obviously, but I was finding that sort of this notion of sort of them pitching up in the morning and me talking at them for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour at the start of the day before getting into some really sort of deep, really enjoyable learning was not very conducive in many ways, and therefore we started using sort of the virtual learning environment more. On there would be sort of session outlines and narrated pre-session PowerPoints, what they would actually do. The sort of more, if you like, lecture orientated part of the work would be done before they ever arrived. What now is called a flipped classroom, which I think is sort of a bit of a naff phrase in some ways. All I was doing, this was sort of 5-6 years ago, all I was doing was sort of creating narrated PowerPoints similar to this one, putting them online, getting people to watch them, so that when they came in we could be straight into a debate about what they'd looked at and discuss those ideas, and then take those ideas on into sort of simulations and social learning, etc. And part of that was designing a flexible space. So I sort of managed to get a bit of funding from somewhere to get things like tables with flip tops and caster wheels, so we could get tables out the way if we wanted. By that time we had a wonderful new learning space in the department next to us in museum studies, where there's this massive white wall where you can get sort of 15-20 people scribbling on a white wall at the same time. Couldn't do that. I'm in an Edwardian building, I guess somebody's old bedroom before it became part of our university. But what I could do for 120 quid was put 4 small whiteboards up around the room that served the same kind of purpose. And beyond those sort of face-to-face sessions, I then put step personalised work in that people could follow to go deeper and broader if they wanted. And then we also started bringing in blogs and wikis for particular approaches to learn. The wiki never really took off actually, but the blog, I happened to have 14 students at the time, seven geographical concepts at Key Stage 3, and I got them to work in pairs to develop blog posts about their particular concept over a period of 3 or 4 weeks before they then planned and delivered a lesson to the rest of the group based on their particular concept. So we played around with these ideas and used a lot of informal discussion with the students to begin to develop those sort of frameworks for creating a more sort of blended learning approach. And sort of on this slide, the top photograph is the room that I work in with geography students. As you can see, it's an old sort of Edwardian house bedroom, cast iron radiators made out of old tank metal belching loads of heat out at various points during the year when we can't switch them off. But it's not the most conducive room, but what we've been able to do just by using very simple additions to the room, like the tables that can flip and move out the way, by having the whiteboards around the room, we can make it into a more flexible space, and it is actually quite a nice room to work in. The one below is in museum studies, sort of a new innovative space, lots of tech, plasma screens that you can hook various laptops up to from sort of points in the floor, etc. Got loads of different things. But one of the reasons why I'm sort of showing this is that sort of about 3 years ago we were asked by one of the pro-vice chancellors in the university to carry out an evaluation of 3 innovative learning spaces, of which these are 2. The top one being the budget version, the bottom one being a far more expensive version. And we did some qualitative research with users, tried to understand the spaces, talked to people who'd helped design them, and ultimately we came up with a model for thinking about designing spaces, thinking about what kind of features when you're designing or evaluating spaces might be useful. We came up with what we call this sort of thing called the deep learning model. And what we sort of have been arguing, and these are mostly about small spaces, not sure of their applicability to large lecture theatres where there might be sort of 200-300 people. But first of all, we think the learning space should be dynamic in space and time, that you should be able to move them around, that you should be able to change the characteristics to suit the pedagogy that's going on in the space at a particular time, rather than sort of thinking of rooms as being really quite static. That rooms should be engaging, that the environment should be engaging, that the environment should allow people to focus on their learning. And interestingly, that bottom photograph, just down the right hand side outside of the windows, you can't really see it very easily. There's a load of trees and greenery. And interestingly, amongst our international students, some of the students from China especially really value that. They think this idea that nature is so close to them is absolutely fantastic, and they love learning in that room. It should allow for engaging pedagogy and also therefore sort of multiple learning approaches, whichever the students and the teacher feel are most appropriate at the time. We also do believe that learning spaces should be ecological, seeing learning spaces as being part of a systems approach. So, not seeing learning just taking place within these 4 walls. So there's some wonderful examples in museum studies of students sort of using it as a central space, but then going off to other spaces within a session, so that the space becomes part of a wider network of spaces to accommodate and help develop learning. But also sustainable. I've certainly never used plasma screens when I've been in that lower room, and actually we've had some really interesting debates with other people about whether or not having 4 or 5 plasma screens in a room is appropriate because of the energy use and the issues around sort of sustainability in that way, but also sustainability over time. How tired do rooms get if they're packed with technology and we become over-reliant on particular specific types of technology? How sustainable is that? We need to keep the flexibility of the room so that we're able to adapt and make it sustainable in that way, or we're in the process perhaps having to spend lots of money constantly upgrading the technology. And then we also believe in this idea of spaces being participatory, co-constructivist. I'll sort of give students the choice of how they arrange the room to best suit the kind of learning that they're doing, and that those spaces and the way those spaces develop and the activities that go on within them should be consultative. So I started getting an interest in blended learning, in ideas about more fluid use of physical space, and as a result of that, the year after, I did some more research where we started to understand tried to understand how students learn beyond the seminar room, how they actually learn in spaces away from formal learning. And therefore I started to get more of an interest in this idea of ubiquitous learning, that actually I think at any level, but certainly at HE, students use a lot of different spaces, and learning, as I said sort of earlier on, is actually a rhizomatic process. It's ubiquitous. Not all learning is connected to the actual subject that we're studying at a particular point in time, and therefore I sort of started getting interested in complexity thinking and the idea of emergence, the idea that actually for learning to occur we need emergent systems, and therefore there needs to be a number of linked processes to be present to allow that emergence to happen. And I would argue that this stands for learning at any stage, really. And what I've done here is I've used colours to show sort of pairs of ideas that are actually in tension. So what Davis and Samara talk about is this idea that to make a system emergent, you need to have internal diversity. So you need a system, you need a classroom or a learning environment that is able to react in a variety of different ways, so that you're not just doing the same thing time and time again. There's a diversity of activity, there's a diversity of approaches, so that over time innovative solutions can begin to develop. Innovative solutions can begin to develop out of problems that occur within that. You've got to accept that for that diversity to be present, for that diversity to exist, there needs to be a level of redundancy or duplication. So it needs to be a case of sort of saying, well, we'll try various things, but actually some of those things might be similar, and sort of in their similarities we begin to make judgments about which kind of approach is actually better. And therefore we need redundancy to help us create diversity. In the same way, there's this idea that learning is seen as interactive. It goes back to this idea of learning being not only cognitive and emotional, but also interactive and social. And that therefore, whilst we're trying to get people to learn the same kind of things and learn with particular foci in mind, that we've also got to allow sort of a certain level of individual agency, that people need to be given the space to learn, that people are able to interact and have slightly different views of the area that we're looking at, so that you can get the emergence of new ideas and perspectives. But that, again, to do that, you can't control the learning from a single point all the time. You have to be happy to allow a certain level of sort of group and individual autonomy to occur for those different ideas to create, to develop and emerge. And then finally, they argue that there needs to be a degree of randomness within that learning environment to allow the exploration of possibilities, to give the opportunity for people to create internal diversity and personal agency. But that whilst you allow a level of randomness, the whole thing isn't just chaotic, that actually you need a level of orientated focus. You need the activity to have coherence, and therefore there's this sort of tension between allowing a certain level of randomness and choice and freedom, but keeping that within a framework of coherence, so that everybody's working towards the same end point. It's just that they're not doing all of the time necessarily completely uniform things minute by minute by minute. And therefore, if we can hold all these various things in tension and get them working together, the argument is that actually that's where learning really begins to emerge and surge ahead. In trying to understand that sort of complexity of spaces, complexity and ubiquity of learning, and how learning emerges for different people in different ways, one of the things that we have done in the past is to try and capture that spatial complexity in learning. And this is just an example of an exercise that we did with some master students, where we actually asked them, some people did it as drawings as here, some people took photographs and brought those in. We asked people to get images of all the spaces that they learned in over the course of a week. And for each space where they learned, we asked them to sort of think about the sort of the human side of that. Were they learning alone? Were they learning in groups? Was it sort of both at different times? What were their sort of reactions to those spaces? How did they make them feel? What kind of learning did they do in them? And also, what kind of level of technology and types of technology did they use in those different spaces? And then what we asked them to do as an exercise was to bring those spaces back and then begin to create a sort of a concept map, a mind map of how those different spaces join together, to try and create some notion of their sort of ecology of learning, their ecosystem of learning, how those different spaces and different activities started to fit together to give this overall picture of their learning process within a typical week. And all of them were completely different. Everybody's learning ecologies were very specific to them, which was really interesting because it begins again to show that sort of complexity of learning as a process. So where that sort of got me to at present is this increasing interest in that complexity of space and how people use space to learn, the kind of technologies that they use for learning, especially at HE level where they might be using lots of different devices in different contexts for different purposes, and how those sort of spatial elements and those technological elements begin to sort of coalesce around notions of learning. And that's where I've started to get this notion of sort of blended spaces from. The use of space, the use of technology, the use of learning is very much a blended process. And there's a fantastic report, I think it was out last year, I think it's 2011, called Learning Spaces and Technology, by some guys down at Canterbury Christchurch University that really sort of, I think, sort of help us in this. The way that I've started to conceptualize it, partly because of the kind of groups of people I work with, is that I've sort of started thinking about learning contexts and this notion of blended spaces. So I looking at the kind of data we were getting from students, I think there are, around 4 general kinds of spaces. In general terms, the complexity in the specifics is far greater than this, but looking at those kind of spaces where people learn, there's the formal learning spaces, the sort of seminar rooms, the lecture rooms, etc. There's the personal learning spaces, learning at home, learning in the car, perhaps even learning in the library could be seen as something like that. Virtual learning spaces, websites, blogs, Twitter, Facebook, virtual learning environments. And then with some of the people that I work with, notions of professional learning spaces as well, working in school and that kind of thing. And that actually all of those different spaces link together within this ecology of learning, but importantly, sitting within that in the kind of results that we've gained at a small scale is this sort of ubiquitous use of technologies. That actually one of the things that's quite often for people knitting those various sort of physical spaces and socio-cultural spaces together is the use of technology. Not for everyone though. Some people use them far less, but as a general rule, this sort of general pattern seems to give notions of blended spaces, lots of spaces being used and interacting in different ways and being tied together to a degree by the use of technology. And then I wanted to sort of try and set that in a more sort of general notion of learning, really. So sort of one of the sort of emerging models that I've got at the moment is that over on the right hand side we've got blended spaces, and that's unpacked in greater detail, but those spaces relate and enable learning experiences. And I've tried to put learning experiences roughly at the middle, with the students and the teachers working together, the students working together themselves. I should have a sort of an arrow that comes out of student back into student. Something that I'd missed and was pointed out to me by a colleague during the presentation that I gave on this. But that actually, if we start looking at this, even at HE level, certainly within schools, external policies and standards actually play a role in sort of our ways of thinking, and they feed into the kind of curriculum that we develop and the assessment regimes we develop, and from that how we approach and tackle learning experiences. And therefore, as teachers, we're thinking about all these various elements and holding them in tension and trying to create successful frameworks about, the external factors that are impacting on us, together with then how that filters through to the curriculum and learning and the kind of spaces that we're using with students to make that learning happen. Whilst the students generally are working with us, they may be far less interested, or generally remote to a lot of the external policies and standards. They're only playing an indirect impact on them, but they're interacting with us, with the curriculum, with the learning and spaces. So we sort of get this really quite complex ecology of learning, but in each case that we're looking at sort of either virtual or abstract or concrete spaces, and therefore it's this idea that I see this as a whole series of blended spaces that are operating together to allow an emergence of learning over a period of time. Where are we? Where are we next? I suppose sort of the next part of this journey is that I'm now really interested in the detail of the learning and the detail of how learning operates in particular spaces, and therefore we're now beginning to experiment with understanding and designing learning and thinking about experiments in the complexity of learning. And this is just a very simple cycle for something called lesson study. This is an approach to deep planning, deep understanding of learning that originates in Japan, came across to America nearly a decade ago, and eventually sort of filtered through to England by a guy called Pete Dudley, who was involved with the primary strategy. So primary schools were the first sort of point of contact for lesson study. We're now using this, myself and a colleague are using this heavily in developing our teaching, and we've carried out a number of lesson study cycles especially on our master's teaching. We've started to sort of see how it might embed and be used within school placements with initial teacher education, and it's based around a simple notion really of teachers collaborating together, focusing on areas that they think students have an issue with, a problem within their learning, and then, as it says in number 2 there, deciding on what's called a research lesson, and then deep planning, spending a lot of time planning for a particular session. So most of our master's sessions, for example, are 2 hours long, and when we started this process we were spending anything upwards of sort of 2-3 hours really going into a lot of deep discussion about what a session should look like to meet a particular learning challenge, be it developing critical thinking or looking at a particular area of content that often proved difficult for students, and really thinking deeply about what kind of activities we wanted to use, but in answer to the kind of learning that we envisaged, that we thought we would see if people were learning well, if people were beginning to engage really positively. And therefore you end up with this sort of deep process of discussions about learning, discussions about teaching, and then once you've created that lesson, one of us would teach it, the other would observe, but importantly they'd observe the behaviours of the students. We wouldn't observe each other. The teacher is almost irrelevant in a sense. And then at the end of the session, we now, as standard, will actually interview students, have focus groups, look at work that they've completed to try and get a deep understanding of the process they've gone through. We use a lot of stimulated recall interviews where we ask them to bring notes from the session, then talk us through what kind of notes they were making and why they were making them and what the processes were at the time, because I'm becoming more and more satisfied that actually performative observation, things like Ofsted, are a complete and utter waste of time. There's no way from observing a group of people that you can actually tell the extent of learning. It's impossible. You can get an indication with some people, others you will totally misinterpret the learning journey that they've gone through. Having got that kind of insight and data, that you then go on to evaluate and to look at the lesson, but rather than sort of having a discussion about how well you think it's gone and what you thought of a particular activity, that's very much secondary to the primary discussion about what evidence is there for the learning that we were hoping to see, what kind of learning do we think has happened, and where does that learning need to go next. And then you can use that to amend the lesson to teach again if you've got a parallel group, or taking sort of some of the ideas on and going to the next cycle. What we've done more recently, which has proved incredibly powerful with students, is actually a week before the session that you're going to use for lesson study, is actually sitting them down and discussing the session that you're going to do the following week, and asking them what kind of approaches to pedagogy they would find most useful, giving them an idea of the kind of content you're going to cover, and getting them to think about sort of how we might go around looking at that content and which content is most useful to them. And what's been really surprising and really interesting is that in co-constructing those sessions with students, not only has the planning become easier, but the students have actually led us back towards a blended learning approach. They like to have pre-sessional work, to engage with big ideas, for some of the international students to engage with the language before coming to the face-to-face, which they want far more active in approach. So it's been really quite an amazing experience over the last year to use this, and we're learning more and more all the time about pedagogy and about how various people enjoy learning and how they get the most out of their learning. So this is sort of where we're getting into and where we're moving to. Having looked at lots of spaces and complex spaces and started to get a broad brushstrokes idea of blended spaces, I'm now sort of interested in collapsing that back down to a degree to begin to sort of try and get a deeper understanding of those particular learning spaces in the more formal areas of student learning experiences. What we're also doing as a way of then taking that forward is to then begin to introduce notions of design-based research. So using those deep insights to start thinking about how we can then redesign and reinterpret the curriculum, how we can begin to think about new ways of bringing technology into those spaces, and ultimately, having come back in more deeply and focused within formal learning spaces in the future, then using all of those insights and design-based research to then go back out into those complex spaces, but doing it at a deeper, far more critical level, through really sort of looking at it in depth at how those various spaces and technologies relate to this sort of deeper, renewed, emergent view that we have of learning as a process.